One day, George the Steamroller was waiting for Percy to take him to a new workplace. George was being rude to Rheneas and Skarloey. "You're just worn-out wheels on worn-out rails. You need rocks for your roads," replied Skarloey, "and we're helping you." "I need to flatten little engines in the scrapyard," retorted George. Then Percy arrived to take George away. He was still rebelling. "Railways are no good. Turn them into roads." The little engines were pleased to see him go. "Rollers are rubbish, so good riddance," they called. George grumbled all the way to the old branch line. He was going to turn it into a road. When they arrived, George was rude again. "Bumpy ride on rotten rails. I'm glad it's over." "So am I," said Percy. "Huh," huffed George. Percy was still fuming when he met Thomas. "What's up, Percy?" "It's George. He makes me feel down." "Just ignore him," puffed Thomas. George was now enjoying himself. "Ripping up rails," he chortled. "What a life!" "What do you think of this, Thomas?" Thomas took no notice. George felt insulted. "You're a useless blue puffed ball," he shouted. But Thomas didn't hear. "I'll show him who's boss." At last the workmen reached the level crossing. "What shall we do here?" "Tear it up, tarmac it," said George. So they did, but not properly, and George knew it too. Later, Thomas was travelling home on the same line. He was pulling trucks filled with vegetables. The signalman had forgotten to warn his driver about the crossing. "That's nice, we don't need to stop," said Thomas happily. "Yes, we do," called his driver, but it was too late.
George the Steamroller had an infamous reputation of making things difficult for the engines. They were right to be worried. But as long as George still had work to do on the roads, the other engines had to be content. Edward was bringing a few workmen and mining tools to the quarry. On his way, he passed by Thomas, who was on a flatbed. "Oh dear," exclaimed Edward. "What happened to you, Thomas?" "It's that blasted steamroller," fumed Thomas. "He paved over the rails, causing me to crash into a barn. You be careful around here, Edward, especially on crossings. George will keep causing trouble just to get our attention." "I will. Still, his actions won't go unheard of for long." Meanwhile, George had enjoyed his little trick.
"Railways are no good. Turn them into roads. That'll teach that useless blue puffball to ignore me."
George and his crew were trailing behind a lorry full of tarmac. They stopped at a level crossing waiting for everyone to pass. George grew impatient. He glared at the rails as a naughty idea flew into his funnel. As the gates opened, the lorry proceeded onward. "Come on," called George's driver. "No time to dawdle. Let's move." So George moved. Too quickly. He jumped forward and bumped the back of the lorry, causing some tarmac to spill on the rails. "Oops," said George, pretending he was sorry. On a tight schedule, the crew had no choice but to carry on and clean the mess later, unaware that George had already swept over the spilled tarmac. Later, Edward was approaching the crossing. As he looked on, he saw a man waving a red flag. Danger lay ahead. "Driver, brakes!" His driver wasted no time as Edward's train came to a screeching halt. Just in time. Edward was shocked. At the crossing where the rails once were was a patch of rough tarmac paved over it. They were a few inches away from a nasty accident. "George," growled Edward, "I reckon this is his doing." "It's a good thing you stopped in time," said a voice to Edward. Some townsfolk had arrived to see what the commotion was about. "I saw the whole thing," said a man. "That clumsy steamroller paved over the rails here with tarmac and quickly rolled away before we could call them back. We had phoned for those workmen to return here and fix it," said the signalman, "but they won't be here for the next couple of hours." "I can't wait that long," said Edward sadly. "My train has to arrive at the quarry on time." One of the workmen from Edward's train examined the road. "We could take out our pickaxes and chip away at this rubbish, but it'll take us a while to clear this out." "Maybe we can help," the townsfolk suggested. "If we work together, we can have this lot cleared out in no time." "You would do that?" asked Edward kindly. "Will that be all right with you?" "Of course," answered the crowd cheerfully. "Anything for our Edward. Confusion and delay doesn't suit you anyway." Pickaxes, hammers, and even garden hoes were passed around from one to another. The townsfolk and crewmen were chipping away at the road bit by bit until glimpses of rail were uncovered. Soon, the tarmac was removed completely, and the rails were visible again. "Peep, peep!" Edward whistled happily. "Thank you all for your hard work." Tired but cheery, the townsfolk waved goodbye as the blue engine set off. Shortly, a lorry arrived at the scene. "We're sorry for the inconvenience," said an inspector. "We've come to clean up the mess now." The gentleman laughed. "The mess? Never mind, chap. We've gone ahead and cleared it up for you." The inspector was embarrassed. He turned his heel and muttered something about George in a less than polite tongue.
Next day, Percy told Gordon all about George. "Huh!" snorted Gordon. "You're just a small engine, that's why he's rude to you. He wouldn't dare cause me any trouble." George had been taken to some yards to work. As he was chuffering about, Duck arrived with a train of empty trucks. George was blocking his way, and a truck was stuck on the main line. "Let me through," demanded Duck. "I'm too busy. You'll just have to wait." "There's no time to wait. I must clear my trucks from the main line to let Gordon through." "Pah," said George. "Then he'll have to wait too." Duck's driver went to complain to the station master, but the signalman had already switched the points and set the signal to allow Gordon to speed through. His passengers were singing his praises, and he was making express time. "I'm the greatest, just watch me fly by," he whistled long and loud as he approached the station. Suddenly, he saw a truck on the line ahead. "Get out of my way!" But the truck wouldn't move. Until Gordon forced it. By accident.
Edward was resting at his station.
Gordon was worried that the Fat Controller would be cross. He was, but not with Gordon.
From the quick exchange of words, Edward heard a story involving George.
"Whoever caused this disturbance will have me to answer to,"
boomed the Fat Controller. Edward smirked. "I knew it wouldn't be long." He then thought of whatever punishment awaited old George.
A few days later. "Look who's here," said Thomas. George had been found out by the Fat Controller and punished. He looked miserable. "Now we'll get some peace at last," said Percy. "I want to get rolling again, but I've got to wait a whole week till I do. And then you'll be just as rude as ever. Eh, George?" "I hope not. Don't you?"